The Quiet Weather Station. Episode 2. Rain Measured in Copper. Rain had passed over the valley for most of the afternoon, never heavily enough to blur the farm tracks or hurry the water along the ditches. By the time Elias reached the weather station, the cloud had thinned into a high, even covering, pale above the farther fields. He was in his late 40s, and he climbed the sheltered path with the unhurried certainty of someone familiar with every broad stone beneath his brown leather boots. His cream work shirt was dry beneath a slate wool waistcoat, though the shoulders of the waistcoat gathered a few small drops when he crossed the open yard. Along the veranda rail, rain remained in separate beads, each one holding a softened reflection of the sky. Water left the roof edge only now and then. A drop gathered, lengthened, and fell into the gravel with a sound scarcely louder than a page being turned. Elias paused beneath the cover before going indoors. The station walls smelled faintly of wet lime wash, the path of washed stone, and the valley of damp earth and clipped grass. He rested one hand on the dry veranda post and watched the last water travel through the yard in small, finished ways. A silver thread slipped from a nasturtium leaf and darkened the soil directly below it. Farther down the slope, the wet roof of a tool shed held a dim square of sky, while the hedges beside the farm track looked newly combed and deep green. The air cooled the skin at his open collar without making him draw it closed. When he inhaled, the scents arrived separately at first, stone nearest, grass beyond, then the clean earthen note rising from the beds, and blended as he breathed out. That brief stillness let the walk fall away from his legs, and brought his attention wholly to the station. He could feel the measured weight of the key in his pocket, and picture the glass waiting dry in cedar. Nothing required haste. The afternoon rain had completed its quiet passage, and the first part of his work was simply to receive the measure it had left behind. He took the small brass key from the upper pocket of his slate wool waistcoat and placed it in the lock. The key turned smoothly, as it had after the previous evening's care, and the instrument room door opened inward on dry boards. Elias stepped across the threshold, wiped each brown leather boot on the coir mat, and set the key in its shallow tray beside the blue ledger. The room held the cool, settled air of a place kept closed during rain. He opened the eastern shutter just enough to admit the gray afternoon, then lifted the brass lamp from its wall shelf. A match brought a low amber flame to the wick. He adjusted it until the light lay steadily across the desk without brightening the whole room. On the chair beside the desk rested the cedar instrument case, its grain dark and fine, its brass corners dull with age and handling. The gray enamel mug stood upside down on a cork mat near the washstand. A folded linen cloth waited in the lower drawer. Elias looked over these familiar things before touching the rain equipment. Their places gave the room its working order. Light at the desk, records beneath it, clean tools protected in cedar, water things by the basin, and the wet afternoon kept gently beyond the sill. Measuring glass occupied a padded, upright compartment in the cedar instrument case. Elias unfastened the two small catches and opened the lid until its ribbon stays became straight. Inside, each item was held apart by shaped dividers lined with soft cloth. He removed the glass with one hand around its lower body and the other beneath its base. Its engraved scale caught the brass lamp in narrow horizontal strokes. He inspected the lip, the foot, and the clear walls, finding them dry and free of dust. From a paper sleeve beside the glass, he took a fresh instrument slip and laid it on the desk near the blue ledger. A pencil followed, already sharpened to a rounded working point. He did not open the ledger yet. The slip belonged to the immediate reading and could travel with him to the gauge without exposing the bound record to damp air. Elias set the measuring glass on a small wooden carrier with a circular recess at its center. The recess held the base securely while allowing the glass to remain upright. He placed the pencil and slip under the carrier's narrow retaining band, closed the cedar case without fastening it, and lifted the prepared carrier in both hands. Outside, the copper rain gauge stood beyond the veranda on its circular stone, several paces along the gravel walk. Its upper rim was dark from wetness, and a quiet luster showed wherever the rain had run cleanly down the sides. Elias approached without brushing the nearby grasses. The collecting mouth remained open to the last sparse drops, so he first stood beside it and listened. One drop fell from the roof behind him, another released from the rail. None touched the gauge while he watched. Above the valley, the soft cloud was opening into long, lighter seams, and the remaining moisture hung on leaves rather than moving through the air. Elias set the wooden carrier on the dry half of a low stone bench. He removed the instrument slip and wrote the date, the afternoon hour, and the station mark at the top. Then he returned the pencil beneath the retaining band. The gauge had received the whole of the soft rain in its inner can. Before disturbing it, he examined the circular stone and the collector's seated edge. No splash of mud had reached the copper. No twig crossed the funnel. 2 pale grass seeds rested near the outer rim, light enough to have arrived after the rain slowed, but neither lay inside the measured opening. Elias placed his left palm lightly against the collector to keep it settled, and lifted the funnel by its broad rim. He raised it vertically, allowing the narrow throat to clear the inner can without touching the stored water. A bright drop clung to the underside of the throat. He waited until it rounded and fell into the can, joining the afternoon's collection where it belonged. Then he turned the funnel over and rested it on a folded corner of the wooden carrier, its polished inner surface protected from stone and gravel. The inner can stood within the larger collector, its handle lying flat. Elias lifted it slowly. The water inside moved as one shallow, dark surface, then settled. He held the can above the collector for a moment so that any included in the reading, and with his free hand he brought the measuring glass close. The glass was narrow because the gauge's broad collecting area concentrated a modest fall of rain into a depth that could be read carefully. Elias aligned the can's small pouring lip with the glass and began to tilt, keeping both vessels close enough that the stream traveled only a short, controlled distance. The collected water entered the measuring glass in a clear, quiet thread. Elias poured steadily until the inner can was nearly empty, then reduced the angle and let the final water gather at the lip. He waited for each remaining drop rather than shaking the can. When the last one fell, he returned the can upright and placed it within the empty collector for safety. The measuring glass now held the entire afternoon collection. A few tiny air bubbles clung at first to the wall, bright against the gray sky. Elias set the glass into the carrier's circular recess and gave the wooden base one gentle turn on the bench. The movement released the bubbles without stirring the surface. He allowed the water to become completely still. Its upper edge formed a slight curve where it met the clean glass, lower at the center than at the sides. That curve, rather than the bright reflections above it, would provide the reading. Elias moved the carrier until the scale faced the open yard. The brass lamp remained visible through the station window, but he used the broad natural light for this first observation, keeping the glass shaded by his bide, intrigue. He bent at the knees until his eyes were level with the water, his brown leather boots firm on the washed gravel, and his back comfortably straight. From above, the surface appeared to touch more than one line. From this level, the lower center of the curve met a single engraved division, cleanly. Elias let his gaze rest there, then looked away toward the pale wall and returned to the mark. The same depth presented itself. He turned the carrier a few degrees to remove a narrow reflection, waited again, and read once more. There was no need to guess between divisions. The soft rain had gathered to an exact visible place on the scale. Elias spoke no number aloud. He kept one finger beside the correct line, and wrote the depth in clear figures. Color, ray, hip. Beneath it, he added the time of reading. The pencil moved firmly enough to leave an unbroken line, but not so hard that it scored the paper. He compared the written figures with the scale while still at eye level. Only after the value on the slip matched the glass did he lift his hand away from the engraved mark. The measurement remained on paper, while Elias performed a second, simpler confirmation. He lifted the glass from its recess, keeping it vertical, and checked that no water had gathered on the wooden carrier beneath it. The base was dry. He looked into the empty inner can and found only a bright film at the lowest curve, too slight to form a drop. By holding the can tipped for a few breaths, he let that film gather at the pouring lip. One final bead entered the measuring glass. The waterline rose by less than the space between marks and settled at the same readable division. Elias returned to eye level and confirmed the recorded depth. This small patience mattered not because the rain was exceptional, but because ordinary records became dependable through ordination. He added a neat check beside the number on the slip. The washed air moved softly across the yard, carrying the scent of cedar from the open instrument room and wet mineral from the circular gauge stone. Above the station roof, the lighter seams in the cloud broadened. The rain was over, its collected depth known, and the instrument could now pass from observation into care. Near the edge of the gravel bed, a shallow drain had been laid with clean rounded stones. Elias carried the measuring glass there and poured the recorded water slowly across the center. It darkened, 3 stones slipped between them and disappeared into the ground without splashing his boots. He did not rinse the glass outdoors. The remaining film came from the same clean rain and would be dealt with at the washstand during calibration. He returned the empty glass to its wooden carrier and placed the inner can beside it. The funnel stayed inverted on its protected fold, and the collector remained seated on the circular stone for 1 more minute, while Elias reviewed the instrument slip. Date, hour, station mark, and depth were all present. He drew a short line beneath the entry so no later service note could be mistaken for part of the measurement. Then he tucked the slip into the dry inner pocket of his slate wool waistcoat. The paper lay flat against the creamwork shirt, safe from beads on the copper. With the value secured, no part of the disassembly would have to depend upon memory, and no later detail could alter the afternoon's completed reading. Elias stood beside the empty gauge and looked once across its position. The open sky above it was clearing evenly. The grasses were still, the stone was clean around the base, and the last roof drops fell well behind the collecting circle. He gathered the measuring glass and inner can onto the carrier, leaving room between their edges. The funnel could travel separately and his right remained untouched. The collector and lid would follow on another trip. Carrying fewer pieces kept every movement steady. Elias returned along the short gravel walk, crossed the veranda, and set the first parts inside on the washstand's dry end. The brass lamp cast a warmer circle now that the day outside had begun to fade. He took the instrument slip from his waistcoat pocket and placed it beneath a small brass paperweight on the desk. Beside, but not yet within the blue ledger, the measured stage was fully closed. Outside, the collector waited empty on its stone. Endures, the recorded depth waited in clear pencil. Between them lay no unfinished calculation, only the calm, practical work of taking the copper assembly apart. Weeks. Before bringing in the remaining copper, Elias prepared a place broad enough for the whole assembly. He opened the washstand drawer and removed the folded linen cloth, lifting it by its dry corners. The cloth was undyed, close woven, and marked along one hem with a line of blue thread. He spread it across the long worktable beneath the western window, smoothing the center with the flat of his hand and leaving the edges loose so no part rested on a fold. A wooden drying rack stood at the far end. Beside it he placed a shallow enamel bowl, a soft brush, 2 slim wooden picks with rounded tips, and a second smaller cloth reserved for polished surfaces. These came from fitted spaces in the cedar instrument case and were set down in the order they would be used. Elias kept the measuring glass upright in its carrier near the brass lamp, separate from the copper work. The recorded slip remained under its paperweight beside the closed blue ledger. With wet objects on one side, dry tools on another, and the clear glass protected between them, the room acquired a simple map for the next stage. Every piece would have one place upon arrival, and another after it had been examined. He returned to the circular stone and lifted the loose lid first. The lid had sheltered the inner arrangement without closing the collecting mouth, and its underside held a narrow band of moisture. Elias carried it by the edge, keeping that damp surface away from his slate wool waistcoat. Inside, he set it on the linen cloth with the underside upward. The funnel came next. He supported its broad copper circle with both hands as he crossed the veranda, then laid it on a low wooden ring that kept the narrow throat suspended above the cloth. The inner can followed, its small handle raised so air could move around it. Elias placed it to the right of the funnel, leaving the width of his palm between them. These movements were neither elaborate nor ceremonial. They simply protected soft copper from unnecessary knocks and kept residual water from passing from one component to another. Through the open door he could see the collector still standing alone on its stone, a plain copper cylinder beneath the clearing sky. On the table, the lid, funnel, and can already showed how the parts nested in service when separated. Mast, nani defenda. For the collector, Elias used both hands. He bent, ripped the cylinder below its upper rim, and lifted it straight from the metal seating ring fixed into the stone. A faint circular trace of clean moisture showed where the base had rested. He did not wipe the stone yet. Its level would be checked only after all indoor work was complete. The collector was light without its inner pieces, but wide enough to deserve an unobstructed path. Elias carried it along the gravel walk at waist height, his brown leather boots taking the center of each firm step. At the veranda, he paused to let a roof drop fall ahead of him, then entered the instrument room. He lowered the collector onto a second wooden ring at the left side of the linen cloth. Last came the small seating collar, which lifted freely from the top assembly and fitted beside the lid. The circular stone outside was now bare except for its fixed ring. Indoors, every removable part of the rain gauge had been gathered under steady light. Elias closed the outer door to its day position, leaving a hand's width for the mild, damp air to pass while keeping the working room still. He began arranging the pieces according to their relation rather than their size. The collector occupied the first position, open end upward. Beside it sat the inner can, the vessel that had actually held the measured rain. The seating collar came next, then the funnel on its wooden support, and finally the lid. When viewed from left to right, the sequence showed how water traveled from the broad opening, or the narrow can. Elias adjusted the spaces until no copper edges could meet if the table were lightly touched. He laid the small handle of the inner can away from the funnel and turned the lid so its shallow grip faced upward. The linen cloth absorbed the few drops that released from lower seams, keeping them visible instead of allowing them to run beneath another piece. Elias counted the components once by moving his gaze along the row. Collector, inner can, collar, funnel, lid. The assembly was complete. He then placed the wooden carrier with the measuring glass beyond the dry end of the row. Glass and copper belonged to the same instrument system, yet arranging them separately made their different care clear. Nothing was stacked, hidden, or left outdoors. The broad surfaces revealed small traces that had been difficult to see in the yard. Under the collector's rolled rim lay a faint line of leaf dust, brown-green against the copper. 2 pale grass seeds rested in the shallow angle of the seating collar, exactly where Elias had noticed them before measuring. Near the funnel throat, a darker speck adhered to the wet metal. Elias did not brush any of it yet. He turned the brass lamp slightly so its light crossed the table from the side, making texture visible without glare. Then he inspected each component in the order arranged. His late 40s hands moved with easy economy, one supporting, one turning, neither pressing on a seam. The collector showed no dent. The inner can's lip remained even. The collar sat flat when placed on the cloth. The funnel's circular rim appeared continuous, and the lid met the table ring without rocking. These were observations before cleaning, useful because water and dust could sometimes disguise the simple condition of a surface. Elias made no service note at this stage. He was only learning where the day's ordinary residue had settled and confirming the pieces were ready for gentle washing. At the washstand, he filled the gray enamel mug with warm water from the covered jug. This water was for himself, and he set the mug on its cork mat near the desk, well away from instrument parts. A second pour went into the shallow enamel bowl on the table. That water was only mildly warm, comfortable against the inside of his wrist and suitable for rinsing copper without abrupt change. Elias took one measured drink from the mug, then returned it to the mat with its handle facing outward. The distinction between the two vessels remained obvious. Gray mug by the ledger, white bowl beside the linen cloth. He added no soap or polishing compound to the bowl. The first cleaning required only water, the soft brush, and enough attention to remove loose, natural material. On a narrow tray he placed a second bowl of clear rinse water. The tray's raised lip would keep any stray drop from reaching the desk. The brass lamp shone through a curl of steam above the mug, while the cleaning water itself gave off almost none. The room was comfortably dry, and the open sliver of door admitted the clean scent left after rain. Elias considered how each part should move through the work. The collector, being largest and carrying the dust beneath its rim, would be cleaned first. The inner can would follow, then the collar and lid. The funnel, with its narrow throat and surface intended for later polishing, would be washed last and handled on its wooden support. After rinsing, each item would stand on the rack in the same order, though inverted where its shape. He placed the soft brush beside the collector and the rounded wooden picks beside the funnel, reserving them for any seed or fiber that water did not release. The smaller linen cloth stayed folded at the dry edge, untouched, until all grit had gone. By deciding this sequence before beginning, Elias avoided reaching over wet copper or carrying residue toward a cleaned surface. He rolled the cuffs of his cream work shirt once, and making equal folds below his elbows. The slade wool waistade remained buttoned at the center, clear of the bowl. He moved the gray enamel mug a little farther from the table and checked the instrument slip beneath its brass weight. The recorded depth remained legible and dry. N's component received a place on the drying rack before any water touched it. Elias tested the collector against the 2 broad rails, finding a stable inverted position that left its rim supported at 3 points. He returned it to the linen cloth, The inner can fitted between two narrower pegs without pressure on its pouring lip. The collar could lean upright in a shallow groove, the lid could rest at an angle, and the funnel's rim could settle across a wide circular cradle, while its throat pointed downward into open air. Elias rehearsed these placements only once. The rack was made for station instruments, but a quick check ensured that no wet part would need to be held while he searched for balance. When he finished, the rack was empty again, and the components returned to their row. The exercise had also shown that every piece sat true. No rim wobbled against its supports. No handle caught. Outside, another bead of water left the veranda rail. Its small tap on gravel reached the room through the partly open door. Within, the copper pieces waited on linen, fully disassembled, their next positions already known. Elias then examined the joints that would later require closer attention. He lifted the collector and followed the vertical seam with his eyes. From the rolled top edge down to the base, a thin darkening beside the solder was simply wetness held in the angle. He placed the cylinder back on its ring. The inner can's base seam looked even, the handle pivots clean. On the funnel, he traced the outer line without touching the polished field, noting how the broad cone narrowed into the throat. The dark speck remained near that opening, while the two seeds waited harmlessly in the collar. No part demanded repair or alteration, and the gauge had performed its ordinary task, and the indoor work would restore it to an equally ordinary readiness. Elias appreciated the clarity that disassembly provided. Outside, the gauge could seem like one copper form. Here, arranged from collector to lid, it became a small set of related shapes, each accessible, washable, and understandable. He lowered the brass lamp wick by the smallest amount, as the western window brightened under clearing cloud. The side light remained sufficient to reveal dust, water, and metal without dazzling reflection. With preparation complete, Elias stood at the center of the table and reviewed the room. The wet side linen held 5 copper components in service order. The rack waited beyond them. Warm cleaning water and clear rinse water occupied the raised tray. The brush and rounded picks lay within easy reach. At the dry side, the measuring glass stayed upright in its carrier, and the smaller polishing cloth remained folded. The blue ledger was closed, the rain depth secured on its weighted slip. His gray enamel mug rested by itself on cork. The small brass key remained in its tray. Elias brought the outer door nearly closed now, leaving only the upper vent open so the room would stay calm while surfaces dried. He listened for a moment and heard no rain, only the occasional release of stored drops from roof and leaves. He tested the arrangement with the movements he would soon make. Right hand to the brush, left hand to the collector, one clear step to the rinse tray, then a turn toward the rack. His sleeves cleared the bowl. The collector cleared the lamp. His elbow passed above, no polished surface. He nudged the debris saucer nearer with one fingertip and turned its open side toward the wet cloth so a lifted seat could be set down without crossing the table. The linen felt cool where the copper had released rainwater and dry beneath the waiting tools. In the quiet room, those differences were as plain to his hands as the warmer circle cast by the lamp was to his eyes. A settled layout eased the last need to keep the entire task in mind. He could attend to one rim, one groove, and one clear rinse at a time, knowing the next place was already prepared. He had brought the entire gauge indoors without misplacing a piece or carrying grit across the table. But the assembly was finished, the arrangement settled, and every component was ready to be cleaned in a direct sequence from the broad collector to the funnel's narrow throat. Elias lifted the collector from its wooden ring and held it above the shallow bowl. With the soft brush wet but not dripping, he began beneath the rolled rim where the line of leaf dust had settled. He moved in short arcs that followed the copper's shape, allowing the bristles to enter the shallow angle without bending against it. The brown-green trace loosened at once and entered the water as a faint cloud. Elias turned the collector a hand's breadth and repeated the motion, working around the entire circumference so that a clean-looking section received the same measured attention as the visibly dusty one. The water ran downward over the inner wall and gathered near the base. He tilted the cylinder, poured it back into the bowl, and brushed the vertical seam from top to bottom with almost no pressure. Fine particles lifted from the narrow solder edge. They were the ordinary dust of leaves and open air, not damage to the joint. As the copper cleared, the brush made a soft, regular sound, bristled against metal and then water, a quiet rhythm suited to the dry room after rain. He rinsed the collector with water from the second bowl, turning it so a clean sheet passed over every inner surface. The first rinse carried away a last pale tint. The next remained transparent. Elias examined the rolled rim from below, where a single fragment of leaf skin clung to the edge. Rather than scrubbing harder, he used the rounded end of a wooden pick to lift the fragment whole. It came free and rested on the wet linen like a thin brown comma. He placed it in the small debris saucer beside the tray. A final rinse left no particles moving across the base. Elias held the collector angled until the water narrowed from a runnel to separate drops, then inverted it on the broad rails of the drying rack. Air entered freely from below. The copper cylinder gave one quiet, settling note against the wood and remained stable. On the linen where it had stood, a circular damp mark showed the completed first stage. Elias folded that wet corner inward, preserving a dry working surface for the smaller parts. He looked through the open lower end of the collector and saw only clean copper and the straight line of its seam. The inner can came next. Its narrower body made the soft brush unnecessary across most of the surface, so Elias began by swirling a small amount of warm water within it. The water traveled around the base curve and loosened up fine dust that had entered through the funnel over many mild days. He poured it into the cleaning bowl, where the particles appeared briefly and settled. With the brush, he cleaned the pouring lip and the two small handle pivots, turning the handle upward and then down so the bristles could pass around each attachment. A pale grass fiber emerged from beneath one pivot. Elias caught it on the brush tip and laid it with the leaf fragment in the saucer. He rinsed the can twice. The second water left as clear as it entered, and no bead remained trapped beneath the handle. Elias raised the can toward the western window and rotated it. Its inner wall reflected a continuous soft band of light. He did not polish this vessel. Cleanliness and free drainage mattered more than brightness. He placed it inverted between the prepared pegs, keeping the delicate pouring lip clear of wood. The seating collar held the two pale grass seeds. Elias lowered the collar into the warm cleaning water without stirring, and watched the seeds release from the copper angle. They rose slowly, pale against the enamel, and floated side by side at the surface. He lifted them with the damp brush and transferred them to the debris saucer. Their presence was useful only as a reminder of how easily light field material could settle after rain. Elias brushed the collar's inner groove, rotating the circle through his fingers, while keeping his grip gentle. A narrow brown line dissolved into the water, then vanished during the first rinse. He passed a rounded pick through the groove without scraping. Nothing else emerged. When held edgewise beneath the brass lamp, the collar showed a clean, uninterrupted channel. Elias set it upright in the rack's shallow groove. Water traveled to its lowest point, formed two balanced drops, and fell onto the tray beneath. The seeds and leaf fragments remained collected in one saucer, rather than being sent through the washstand. Later, they could be returned to the garden edge, but for now their removal from the gauge was complete. Lid had gathered more clean rainwater than dust. Elias wiped its broad underside with the wet brush in widening circles from the center toward the rim. At one point, the bristles found a small patch of leaf powder, so fine that it colored the water without holding a shape. He refreshed the brush, passed once more across the same place, and rinsed until the underside felt smooth beneath the flow. The upper grip received a careful stroke along both sides. Elias turned the lid by its edge and let clear water run away from the center, carrying the last powder toward the bowl. He checked the rim for trapped fibers, found none, and stood the lid at an angle in the rack. Its wet surface reflected the brass lamp as a long amber oval that slowly sharpened while droplets descended. 4 components now occupied the rack: collector, inner can, collar, and lid. Their washed surfaces differed in tone, some darker while wet and some already beginning to dry, but every edge and recess was free of leaf dust and seeds. The funnel remained alone on its wooden support, the last and most precise piece to clean. Elias moved the shallow bowl aside and replaced the cleaning water. The earlier water had become lightly clouded by dust, though no grit remained suspended. Fresh warmth protected the funnel from receiving material already removed from other components. He held the funnel by its rim and dipped only the throat at first. Water entered the narrow passage and released the darker speck Elias had noticed during arrangement. It drifted out as a softened fleck of leaf dust. He caught it in the debris saucer, then poured warm water across the broad cone from above. The flow followed the copper evenly into the throat. Elias watched the exit beneath. ensuring it formed one clear stream rather than separating around an obstruction. With the soft brush he circled the upper rim, keeping strokes in the direction of the curve. He then used the slim rounded pick, wrapped once in damp linen, to pass through the throat. The linen emerged with a faint tan mark on its leading edge. A second clean fold emerged unmarked. This was enough. Repeated rubbing would offer no further benefit. He rinsed the funnel from 3 positions. First, water entered at the broad mouth and left through the throat. Second, he turned the piece and let water rise backward through the opening, releasing anything resting at the lower edge. Third, he returned it upright and poured one final clear measure down the center. Each passage ran freely. Elias held the funnel above the wall and the thread became drops. 1. Zon Nus. A grass seed could have crossed the opening only if it found a place to lodge, but the clean throat gave none. He looked through it toward the brass lamp. A small amber circle appeared, centered and complete. The view did not prove the finish of the copper that belonged to the next stage, but it confirmed that leaf dust, seed fragments, and rinse water no longer obscured the passage. Elias placed the funnel on the circular cradle of the drying rack, broad rim supported, and throat pointing down. One last drop gathered there, flashed in the lamp, and fell. The entire gauge now stood in separate, clean parts, with air moving around every surface. The linen cloth had done more than protect the table. Its damp areas showed where each unwashed component had rested, and its dry sections confirmed that cleaned pieces had gone directly to the rack. Elias collected the small fragment of leaf skin, the grass fiber, the 2 pale seeds, and the softened speck from the debris saucer. He tipped them onto a square of scrap paper, folded it once, and set it near the outer door to be emptied beside the grasses later. No debris went into the instrument case or remained near the calibration glass. He rinsed the soft brush, pressed its bristles gently between 2 fingers to restore their shape, and laid it across the tray to dry. The rounded wooden picks received a clear rinse and a wipe with the used corner of linen. Elias emptied the clouded cleaning water into the gravel drain outside, returned, and rinsed the enamel bowl. The clean rinse bowl stayed on the table for the coming glasswork. By separating natural debris, used water, and clean tools, he brought the washing stage to an orderly conclusion. Drying required waiting more than handling. Elias lowered the cuffs of his creamwork shirt and took the gray enamel mug from its cork mat. The water remained pleasantly warm. He sat in the wooden chair beside the desk, where he could see the rack without standing over it, and drank slowly. The brass lamp made warm shapes along the wet copper, while the clearing window offered cooler light from the valley. Droplets traveled down the collector's inner wall and fell at longer intervals. The first struck the tray with a rounded tack. The next followed after several breaths, softer because less water remained behind it. On the inner can, a bead moved around the base curve, paused beneath the handle pivot, and finally let go. Elias watched its path without leaning forward. The rack was doing what his hands no longer needed to do, holding every opening toward air and every delicate edge away from wood. Warmth from the mug spread across his palms, and the faint mineral scent of the rinse water gave way to the drier smell of linen and cedar. As the metal lightened, the separate parts seemed to regain their familiar tones. Quiet brown at the collector, a muted rose along the lid, amber at the funnel where the lamp crossed it. On the funnel, the broad cone dried from the rim inward, leaving a dark circle that steadily narrowed toward the throat. Elias did not hurry it with a rough cloth. Rubbing while particles or hidden moisture remained could mark the soft surface. Instead, he opened the upper vent another finger's width and allowed the room's ordinary air to do the work. The choice to wait felt complete rather than idle. Clean water was leaving clean copper by the route he had prepared. The blue ledger stayed closed beside the weighted slip. A measurement had already been made. This interval belonged entirely to clean metal becoming dry enough for inspection and polish. When no further drops fell, Elias rose and tested dryness without touching the visible fields. He placed a fresh corner of the linen cloth beneath the collector rim. It came away unmarked. The same check beneath the inner can, collar, and lid found no moisture. At the funnel throat, a tiny coolness remained. Elias left that part on its cradle while he transferred the other pieces back to the dry half of the table. The collector returned first, then the inner can, collar, and lid, all in their earlier service order. Their wash surfaces were clean but not artificially bright, carrying the quiet brown and rose variations natural to copper. After several more minutes, the funnel throat released no dampness to the linen. Elias moved it, cradle and all, to the center beneath the brass lamp. The cleaning stage was complete. Leaf dusts, seeds, fibers, and rinse water had been removed in sequence. The tools were clean. The table had a dry working field. Now the circular rim and cone could be polished, and their throat and seams verified without any grit beneath the cloth. With the funnel clean and dry, Elias unfolded the smaller linen cloth reserved for finishing copper. It was soft from many washings, and carried no seam across its center. He set the funnel on the circular wooden cradle so the broad cone faced upward, then placed the brass lamp to one side rather than directly above it. In raking light, dullness and residue would show plainly. Elias folded the cloth around 2 fingers and began at the outer rim. His hand traveled with the copper circle in overlapping arcs, never cutting abruptly across it. The first pass removed the flat gray cast left by drying water. Beneath it emerged a muted warmth, less like a mirror than late sunlight held in brown metal. Elias rotated the cradle instead of reaching across the funnel. Each quarter turned toward him, received the same light pressure, and moved on. The work made no sharp squeak, only the faint hush of linen. He stopped after completing the circumference, and compared the beginning with the end. The tone was even, the rolled edge smooth, and no loose fiber from the cloth remained caught along the curve. He polished the broad cone next, beginning near the rim and following gradually smaller circles toward the throat. The linen gathered a slight brown trace, the harmless bloom that develops on copper exposed to open air and rain. Elias changed to a clean fold before continuing, keeping removed residue from being spread back across the surface. Under the brass lamp, the cone warmed from rain-darkened brown to a restrained rose-gold glow. It was not made brilliant, nor did it need to be. The purpose of the pass was to reveal the surface clearly enough that a flaw, obstruction, or lingering mark would not hide beneath moisture. Elias supported the underside with his free hand, careful to place his palm only on the narrow lower collar. The funnel remained stable on the ends. His circles narrow. The light gathered more evenly around the center. At the throat he stopped, turned the cloth to another clean section, and polished only the accessible outer lip. Nothing was pushed through the opening. The channel had already been washed, and its clean passage mattered more than brightness within. One dull crescent remained on the cone, no wider than Elias's thumb and slightly below the rim. It held the lamplight differently from the surrounding copper. Elias did not press harder. He turned the cradle until the crescent lay nearest the western window, where cool natural light replaced amber reflection. The mark showed a familiar whorl at one edge, a fingerprint left beneath wet dust when the funnel had been handled on an earlier day. Its oils had sheltered a small patch from the rain's even darkening. Elias breathed gently onto the clean linen rather than onto the copper, and passed once along the curve. The cloth moved from the wider end of the crescent toward its taper, following the direction already established by the circular polish. Most of the crescent faded. He lifted his hand instead of reversing the stroke, opened the linen across his palm, and found a faint curved shadow on the weave. That small transfer explained the altered color, without asking anything harsher of the metal. He refolded the cloth and repeated the same light motion. The remainder disappeared, leaving the surface continuous with the surrounding tone. To confirm it, he rotated the cradle through a full. The bright band from the window traveled over the former mark without bending, and the lamp's amber reflection followed with no dull interruption. Elias let his shoulders settle. A trace that had first asked for attention had yielded to the least forceful useful action, and the funnel retained the soft serviceable color of the rest of the gauge. He viewed it again under the brass lamp, then at the window. No crescent returned. The mark had been superficial, and the gentle second pass was sufficient. Elias laid the used cloth flat beside the cradle, fingerprint residue facing upwards so it would not contact the funnel again. The rim received a tactile check after polishing. Elias ran the linen-covered pad of one finger around its complete circumference, using the cloth as a guard between skin and clean copper. The rolled edge remained smooth and regular. There was no flattened place, raised burr, or interruption where water could gather. He then turned the funnel on its side within the cradle and examined the line where cone met rim. The soldered seam formed a fine continuous boundary, slightly darker than the field around it. Elias followed it visually by rotating the cradle in small increments. At each position he changed the angle of the brass lamp, letting the light cross rather than flood the joint. A sound seam kept the same narrow width and showed no pale gap. This one did. At the final quarter, a tiny spot of dried linen lint rested near the joint. Elias lifted it with the dry soft brush, then reviewed that section again. The copper beneath was intact. He made a small, satisfied pause before returning the funnel upright. Its broad circle was clean, polished, and mechanically unchanged. The narrow throat required a different view. Elias removed the lamp's glass chimney, trimmed no wick, and simply shifted the steady flame farther behind the funnel so the light would shine through without heating the metal. Holding the rim with both hands, he raised the funnel to eye level. The throat presented a single bright circle. He rotated the funnel slowly. If a seed, leaf fiber, or folded edge had remained, the circle would have changed shape or dimmed at one side. It stayed round and centered through the full turn. Elias lowered the funnel, passed the clean rounded wooden pick through once without resistance, and raised it again. The same circle returned. He checked from the opposite direction as well, looking from the narrow end toward the broad cone. The station window appeared as a small pale opening beyond it. Both views were free. Elias replaced the lamp chimney and returned the wick to its earlier calm height. The throat needed no scraping, adjustment, or further cleaning. Water could pass from collecting cone to inner can along the intended clear path. He inspected the throat's outer seam where the narrow tube joined the cone. This joint carried the collected water, so its continuity mattered more than a bright finish. Elias set the funnel upside down on the cradle, which supported the rim while leaving the lower joint accessible. With the brass lamp to his left, he followed the solder line using a small hand lens from the cedar instrument case. The lens enlarged texture without requiring him to bring the metal close to the flame. Around most of the circle, the solder formed a smooth gray band. A dark point appeared near the back, but when Elias changed the light, it resolved into the narrow shadow of the joint itself. He touched the area with the dry corner of linen. Nothing caught, moved, or marked the cloth. The full seam was firm. He repeated the check where the tube ended, finding the lower opening evenly rounded. No water stain extended from either joint. Elias returned the hand lens to its padded slot and set the funnel upright once more. The other copper parts received a modest finishing pass, enough to make their condition readable without turning the evening into a display of brightness. Elias wiped the collector around its upper rim, following the circumference as he had on the funnel. He polished the inner can's pouring lip and handle, then the seating collar and lid grip. Their broader brown surfaces remained softly varied, appropriate to instruments used outdoors. As each part was finished, he placed it on a clean section of linen in service order. He took care not to polish over seams until residue might obscure them. Instead, after wiping, he inspected the collector's vertical joint, the can's base circle, and the lid's folded edge beneath the same sidelight. All remained even and dry. The linen showed no green stain or unexpected roughness, only the faint brown trace of ordinary copper bloom. Elias folded those used areas inward. The components now shared a calm, warm tone under the brass lamp, distinct shapes belonging to one gauge, each clean enough for confident reassembly. But verify the joins without filling the entire collector. Elias used a small spoonful of clear water. He held the funnel above the rinse bowl and let the water circle once around the upper cone. It gathered toward the center, entered the throat, and left below in one unbroken stream. No bead appeared along the outer throat seam. He dried the lower edge with clean linen and repeated the pour from the opposite side of the cone. Again the stream traveled only through the opening. This simple check confirmed what the visual inspection had shown. Elias shook nothing and applied no pressure. Gravity, the same quiet force used in every rainfall, was sufficient. He placed the funnel back on the drying cradle for the few drops remaining within the throat to descend. The polished surface held a soft ring of reflected lamplight, unbroken on Narration. On the service slip, beneath the recorded depth, Elias wrote a concise note: funnel cleaned, throat clear, seams firm. The words described completed observations, not assumptions. While the funnel dried, Elias cleaned the polishing area. A smaller linen cloth was folded with used surfaces inward and placed in the washstand's laundry pocket. The hand lens returned to the cedar instrument case. The soft brush, already dry at the bristles, went into its shaped channel. Elias wiped the circular cradle with the untouched edge of the larger cloth and checked it for moisture. He moved the polished components farther from the enamel bowls, preserving a clear dry field for later reassembly. Then he drank the remainder from the gray enamel mug and rinsed it separately at the basin. The mug returned upside down to its cork mat. Its domestic warmth had accompanied the work without entering the instrument process. Outside, the western cloud had become a thin pewter veil above open bands of pale evening. The roof no longer released stored drops. The station room held only the lamp's low sound and the occasional settling of wood. Copper care was almost complete, and the clear measuring glass waited for its own independent verification. Elias performed one final review from collector to lid. The collector's upper edge was clean, its seams straight. The inner can held no dust and poured freely. The seating collar's groove was empty, with both pale seeds removed. The funnel bore an even muted polish. The fingerprint crescent had vanished. Its throat showed a complete circle to the light. Both solder joins were firm and dry. The lid's rim and grip were clear. He did not assemble them yet. Calibration of the measuring glass had to occur while known water and a level table were available. Without copper crowding the working space, Elias carried the 5 components, still separate, to the dry rack at the side wall and covered them loosely with the clean half of the linen cloth, allowing air beneath. The funnel remained on its cradle, so its polished surface touched nothing. On the main table he left the wooden carrier, the measuring glass, 2 enamel bowls, and the weighted service slip. The copper stage ended fully verified. The next work would concern the engraved lines that had translated afternoon rain into a recorded depth. The measuring glass had remained upright throughout the copper work. Protected in the wooden carrier, Elias brought it to the center of the cleared table and examined it before adding calibration water. Its base sat fully within the circular recess. The engraved marks rose in fine increments along one side, each deeper numbered line separated by shorter divisions. Elias turned the glass slowly beneath the brass lamp. No film from the afternoon rain clouded its wall, and the lip showed no chip. He rinsed it once with clear water from the covered jug, rotating the small amount around the inside before emptying it into the rinse bowl. The last drops descended when he inverted the glass over the rack. He then stood it upright and allowed the remaining moisture to merge into a transparent film. Calibration did not require the vessel to be dry at the beginning if both editions were controlled. But Elias preferred a clean, evenly wetted surface so droplets would not cling above the waterline. While the film settled, he checked the table with a small spirit level. The bubble rested between its 2 marks along both directions. From the cedar instrument case, Elias removed a calibration flask fitted with a narrow stopper. The flask was small, clear, and marked by a single dark line around its neck. When the lower edge of the water curve met that line, the vessel held a known volume. Elias inspected the stopper and neck, then rinsed the flask with the same clear water used for the glass. He filled it from the covered jug to a little above the mark, and set it on the level table. Using a clean glass dropper, he removed water 1 drop at a time. The curved surface descended until its lower center met the dark line exactly. Elias lowered his eyes to verify the meeting point without parallax, just as he had read the rain outside. The flask now contained its known volume. He dried 1 bead from the outside of the neck with linen, leaving the inner measure untouched. The measuring glass stood beside it, its engraved scale facing him. Both vessels caught the brass lamp in fine vertical highlights, but the working marks remained plainly visible against a sheet of blue-gray paper placed behind them. Elias removed the stopper and poured the first known volume into the measuring glass. He kept the flask's lip close to the glass so the stream entered without splash. When the stream ended, he held the flask inverted for 3 calm breaths, allowing the last complete drop to leave. He did not tap the vessels together. The measuring glass received the water and settled almost at once. Elias returned the empty flask to its padded ring, then bent until his gaze met the scale. The lower center of the water curve rested at the expected first calibration mark. He checked from directly ahead and shifted neither glass nor table. A view from either side would make the curve appear higher or lower, so he centered the engraved line between his eyes. The match was exact. On the service slip, below the copper note, he wrote the known volume and a small first tick. The afternoon reading remained above it, separated by the line he had drawn outdoors. Measurement and service evidence occupied the same slip, but could not be confused. For the second edition, Elias refilled the calibration flask. Again he went slightly above the dark neckline, then used the dropper to bring the lower curve down with single drops. The repetition was deliberate. A known vessel became useful through the same preparation each time. He checked the outside for clinging water, removed the stopper, and poured into the measuring glass. The new stream joined the first volume, raising the waterline through several engraved divisions. Elias waited until the surface stopped moving. The combined volume reached the expected second mark. He looked away toward the blue ledger, returned his eyes to the curve, and found the same alignment. A second tick went on the service slip. He also viewed the base. No water had escaped into the carrier recess, and no bubble rested against the wall. The measuring glass responded evenly to two separate, known additions. Its scale had agreed at two useful points, not merely at the first shallow depth, and its stable base allowed each result to be read without holding him. A patient check included repeatability, so Elias emptied the clean calibration water into the enamel bowl and prepared to begin again. He rinsed both vessels once, then set them inverted on the rack until visible drops had left. The room had cooled slightly with evening, but flask and glass shared the same air and stood side by side. Elias used the waiting interval to straighten the service slip beneath its brass paperweight and to turn the brass lamp wick a fraction higher. The light remained steady, not glaring. When the vessels were ready, he placed the blue-gray paper behind the scale again. He filled the flask to its line using the same pour-and-drop method. The first repeated volume entered the measuring glass and met the first expected mark. Elias recorded no new prose, only a second small tick beside the first. The check was not intended to produce novelty. Its value lay in returning the same answer after the vessels had been emptied and reset. He added the second repeated volume. The water rose, slowed, and became still at the second expected mark, precisely where it had rested before. Elias observed it at eye level for several breaths. At first, a hair-thin shimmer crossed the surface from the final pour. It shortened from both ends, gathered against the glass, and disappeared, leaving the lower center of the curve quiet on the line. Elias placed the pad of one finger lightly on the table beside the carrier, not touching it, and felt no movement through the boards. The line did not depend upon the brass lamp's reflection. When he shifted the lamp slightly aside, the curve continued to meet the engraving. He replaced the lamp and made the final tick. The pencil point gave a dry, brief sound against the slip, a small ending after the fluid motions of filling and pouring. 4 agreements now appeared on the service slip. First and second volume. Then, first and second volume again. Elias followed them in order with the pencil held above the page, pairing each mark with the addition he had just completed. The repeated pattern was easy to see, and left no loose question for the closing note. No adjustment was needed. The glass required no correction label, and the recorded rain depth stood on its ordinary scale without qualification. A quiet satisfaction came from that ordinary result. The vessel asked only to be dried and returned to its fitted place, while the afternoon figure could remain exactly as written. Elias wrote a concise conclusion beneath the ticks, measuring glass checked with known volumes, scale and base true. He returned the brass paperweight to the top edge, so the slip could dry where a tiny drop from his cuff had touched only the blank margin. The written lines remained clear. Before emptying the glass, Elias turned it carefully through a complete circle within the carrier. From every side, the water remained level against the engraved face, and the base stayed seated without rocking. He looked along the vertical axis to confirm the walls were clean and the scale readable. A faint bright band from the western window moved across the glass as it turned, revealing no haze. Elias returned the engraving to face forward, and took one last reading of the second known mark. It agreed. He then poured the clean water into the enamel bowl, holding the glass inverted long enough for the final drop. The calibration flask was emptied as well. This water had touched only clean glass and could be poured into the gravel drain. Elias carried the bowl outside, released it over the rounded stones, and returned with the enamel dry on its outer surface. The sky above the gauge stone was now open in the west, while a soft bank of cloud moved away beyond the valley. The weather remained quiet and mild. At the washstand, he rinsed the measuring glass and calibration flask with a final small amount of clear water. The glass went upright on its padded carrier after draining, since its base should not bear against the rack's pegs. The flask rested inverted in its own narrow cradle. Elias used no cloth inside either vessel. Air drying left the engraved glass free of fibers. He cleaned the dropper by drawing and releasing clear water several times, then laid it on linen. The blue-gray backing paper returned to the cedar case, followed by the stopper once the flask neck was dry. Every calibration item had a fitted place, and Elias kept the case open until the final moisture disappeared. On the service slip, the ticks and conclusion formed a compact record beneath the afternoon depth. He compared the date at the top with the open calendar card on the desk, then checked the written known volume against the marking on the flask. Both matched. He had tested the scale using what the station carried for that purpose, repeated the result, and documented the agreement without adding unnecessary notation. The copper components waited beneath the loose linen cover. Elias uncovered them only after the glass calibration was fully finished and the water bowls had been removed from the main table. He lifted each part and found it dry. The polished funnel showed no new fingerprint because it had remained on its cradle. He placed the collector, inner can, collar, funnel, and lid in a carrying order near the outer door. The measuring glass returned to its padded compartment in the cedar instrument case, its scale facing outward. The dry calibration flask and dropper went into their own divisions. Elias closed the lid, fastened both catches, and left the case on the instrument room shelf. It would not travel to the gauge stone. The outdoor restoration required only the copper assembly, the spirit level, the linen cloth, and the service slip already protected beneath the paperweight. By reducing the next trip to necessary items, he kept clean glass safely indoors and both hands available for seating the collector. Elias reviewed the completed calibration before changing stages. The measuring glass had been rinsed, placed on a verified level surface, and checked at 2 marks with separately prepared known volumes. The sequence had been emptied and repeated. Each result returned to its expected engraving. The base remained stable, the walls clear, and the scale readable from its working side. No adjustment, correction, or replacement was required. He folded the dry part of the linen cloth over his arm and slipped the service slip into his waistcoat pocket, where it lay flat against his creamwork shirt. The small spirit level went into the other pocket, protected by a narrow felt sleeve. With the collector held in both hands and the remaining copper ready for a second trip, Elias opened the station door. The evening air entered, washed and mild. The calibration stage had ended, with a dependable glass returned to cedar. Ahead lay the bare circular stone, ready to receive its clean gauge at the proper level. Elias carried the empty collector from the instrument room with both hands around its lower body. The clean copper held a muted warmth from the brass lamp, which cooled to a deeper brown as he stepped into the evening. His brown leather boots crossed the veranda boards and found the center of the gravel path. The circular stone lay bare ahead, its fixed metal ring visible against the pale surface. Elias set the collector on the low bench rather than directly into place. He unfolded the linen cloth and wiped the stone from center to edge. Rain had left a clean sheen, but a few grains of gravel rested near the fixed ring, carried there by the earlier movement of his boots. He brushed them gently into the surrounding path. The cloth passed once around the inner edge of the ring and came away with only clear moisture. Elias folded that damp section inward. Above him, the sky had opened to a broad, quiet, gray blue. No drops fell into the working area, and the roof behind him had finished releasing its stored rain. He inspected the stone before seating the gauge. The fixed ring was firm, its circular edge clear. Elias ran 2 fingers over the stone inside it, feeling for grit that might tilt the collector. Most of the surface was smooth. Near the left edge, 1 grain remained, pale and nearly the same color as the stone. He lifted it with the corner of the linen cloth and held it for a moment on his palm. It was no larger than a coarse grain of sand, ordinary gravel, pressed inward. When the collector had been removed, Elias dropped it beyond the stone where it joined the path. He wiped the seating surface once more, then placed the collector within the ring. The cylinder descended without scraping and rested on its base. He turned it a few degrees, not to force it into place, but to confirm that the ring allowed an even seat. The collector remained upright to the eye. Elias stepped back, viewed it against the station wall, and saw no lean. The precise check would come from the spirit level. From the felt sleeve in his waistcoat pocket, Elias removed the small spirit level. Its brass-edged body was short enough to lie across the collector rim. He wiped its lower face with clean linen and placed it east to west. The bubble moved slowly, then rested a shade to the left of the 2 center marks. Elias waited in case the collector had settled on the damp stone. The bubble did not change. He lifted the level, rotated it end for end, and set it on the same line. Again the bubble stopped to the same physical side, confirming that the slight lean belonged to the seating rather than the tool. Elias did not press down on the opposite rim. Pressure might hide the cause without removing it. Instead, he lifted the collector straight up and returned it to the bench. A close look at the seating surface revealed another single grain near the inner edge, darker now that the surrounding stone had dried. It had likely rolled from beneath the fixed ring when the collector turned. Elias brushed the dark grain away with the dry corner of the cloth. He checked the entire circle by touch, then lowered the collector into place again. The spirit level returned east to west. This time, the bubble drifted to the center and rested evenly between its marks. Elias turned the level north to south. The bubbles settled in the same balanced position. He repeated both directions after rotating the collector a quarter turn within the fixed ring. The readings remained centered. The stone itself had not shifted. Only 2 loose grains had interrupted the first seat, and both now lay safely in the surrounding gravel. Elias removed the level and looked across the bare rim at eye height. It formed a straight line against the station wall. He slipped the tool back into its felt sleeve but kept it nearby on the bench for a final check after assembly. The collector stood clean, empty, and level, restored to the exact circle it had occupied before the afternoon reading. On his second trip, Elias brought the inner can, seating collar, polished funnel, and lid. He arranged them on the linen-covered bench in assembly order. The inner can entered first. Elias raised its small handle, lowered the vessel into the collector, and let the handle settle flat without striking the side. The can sat at the center. Next, he placed the seating collar, aligning its groove with the collector rim. It met the copper in one quiet contact, and lay flat all around. Elias lifted it once, turned it a half circle, and seated it again to confirm that its fit did not depend upon one position. The result was the same. He then took the funnel by its protected outer edge. In the open evening light, the muted polish showed a continuous warm circle. Elias lowered the throat through the collar until it rested above the inner can. No edge caught, and the broad rim met its support evenly. The clear passage he had inspected indoors now pointed directly into the empty vessel below. Before setting the lid, Elias checked the assembled rim with the spirit level. East to west, the bubble remained centered. North to south, it did the same. The addition of the inner pieces had not disturbed the collector's seat. He removed the level, wiped it, and returned it to its felt sleeve. The lid fitted last, its grip aligned in the familiar direction so it could be lifted without reaching across the collected mound. Elias lowered it gently until the folded edge met the seating points. The gauge was whole again. He walked around the circular stone once, viewing the copper from each side. The collector remained upright. The lid and funnel appeared concentric. No linen fiber rested on the polished cone. He looked down the open collecting circle without leaning over it. At the center, the dark throat lay clear above the can. The gauge stood ready beneath the open sky, emptied of the rain already recorded, and prepared for the mild night ahead. Elias carried the linen cloth and spirit level back indoors. At the desk, he removed the instrument slip from his waistcoat pocket and placed it to the right of the blue ledger. He opened the ledger to the current page, where ruled columns held the station's daily observations. The brass lamp illuminated the paper with a steady amber circle. Elias copied the afternoon depth into the rain column, preserving the same figures, with blue check, and he checked the glass reading in memory only after comparing the 2 written entries. The comparison, not recollection, was the safeguard. The ledger figure matched. In the service column he wrote that the gauge had been disassembled and arranged indoors. Leaf dust and 2 pale grass seeds removed. Copper surfaces cleaned, funnel throat and seams verified, and measuring glass checked twice with known volumes. His handwriting remained compact and open. Each statement described work completed that evening, in the order it had occurred. He added the final outdoor note. Circular stone wiped, loose gravel removed, gauge level restored and verified in 2 directions after assembly. The sentence brought the service record to its proper close. Elias read the full line from beginning to end, then checked the afternoon depth once more against the instrument slip. He placed a small finishing mark in the ledger margin and blotted the fresh writing with a clean sheet. The blue cover weighted beneath his left hand. Before closing it, he entered the observation time and his initials in their narrow columns. No blank remained within the entry, and no reminder needed carrying to another day. Elias shut the ledger gently and returned the brass paperweight to its usual place on top. The instrument slip went into the dated envelope in the shallow record drawer. He slid the envelope behind the preceding day's slip, closed the drawer, and turned its simple wooden catch. The reading and the care record now rested in their permanent station order. The remaining room work was brief and complete. Elias folded the linen cloth with its damp sections inward and draped it over the back rail of the chair to dry overnight. The spirit level, freed from its felt sleeve, returned to the fitted space in the cedar instrument case. The sleeve lay beside it, so both could air. He checked that the measuring glass and calibration flask were dry, then closed the case and fastened its 2 catches. The case went onto its cedar shelf, neither carried away nor left open. The enamel bowl stood inverted at the washstand. The gray enamel mug, rinsed and dry, returned to its cork mat. Elias lowered the brass lamp wick until the light drew close around the closed blue ledger. He took the small brass key from its tray and placed it in the upper pocket of his slate wool waistcoat. Every object manged by the evening's work had returned to a settled place. Glass in cedar, record in blue cloth, cloth airing on wood, mug on cork, pea ready for the door. From the veranda, Elias looked once toward the restored rain gauge. Evening had cleared enough for a pale band of sky to rest above the valley rim. The copper assembly stood level on its circular stone, clean but softly colored, its open mouth receiving only the cool air. The afternoon's water no longer remained within it because that water had already become an exact ledger entry. The 2 pale seeds and leaf dust had been removed, the fingerprint cresset cleared, the throat opened to a perfect circle of light, and the known volumes had returned the measuring glass to its expected marks. Nothing in the sequence asked for another check. Elias allowed his gaze to travel once through the whole completed route, from the open collecting circle to the stone beneath it, along the gravel walk, across the wiped veranda boards, and through the window to the desk where the ledger lay closed. Each place held only what belonged there. The gauge contained clear air, the drain stones were dark where clean water had passed, and the room carried the mingled scents of dried linen, cedar, and a lamp turned low. A cooler current moved across the yard and touched the back of his hands. He drew one slow breath, feeling the day's close not as weariness but as the ease that followed careful work, brought fully to rest. In the valley below, wet leaves released their brightness as the light thinned, and the farm track remained a pale, steady line between the fields. Elias closed the eastern shutter, drew the station door inward, and turned the small brass key. The latch settled. He placed the key securely in his waistcoat pocket and descended the sheltered path at an easy pace. Creamwork shirt, quiet on the broad stones, with bark-like hop. At the lower turn, the scent of damp grass rose again, softer now, and one last bead slipped from the hedge without disturbing the stillness. Behind him, the record was closed, and the gauge was empty, level, and ready for night. The soft rain had been measured completely.